So, what if the exact date for the end of the world wasn't a mystery at all? Today, we're going to dive into some source material that claims to have completely cracked the code. It lays out this incredibly precise year-by-year timeline from our near future all the way to the beginning of eternity. Let's dig in and see how they did it. Right off the bat, the material poses this huge question. Can we actually predict the end times? I mean, most interpretations say absolutely not. But this author argues that actually, yeah, you can. That the Bible has a hidden timeline, and all the clues are just sitting there waiting to be unlocked. And boom, here's the first big number they drop on us, 2070 AD. According to this text, that's the year the millennium begins. But how on earth do you get a number that specific? Well, it turns out it all comes down to a really unique set of keys for decoding the scripture. Okay, so to really get how this all works, we've got to understand these three foundational keys the author uses. Think of them like a decoder ring for translating biblical passages into an actual concrete timeline. They're basically the engine driving every single calculation we're about to see. All right, first key up, the biblical generation. The whole idea here comes from Genesis 6:3, where God says that man's days will be 120 years. So the logic is pretty straightforward. One generation equals 120 years. Got it? Cool. Next, we've got the second key, the prophetic day. This one's pulled from that recurring biblical phrase, time, times, and half a time. The author decodes this to mean exactly 3.5 years. Definitely hang on to that number, because it's a huge building block for everything that comes next. And then there's the third key. And this is where things get, well, really symbolic. The author zooms in on a verse in Matthew about adding a cubit to one's life. Now, a cubit, as you might know, is a measure of length, of distance. But in this system, nope, it gets converted straight into time. So 1 cubit equals 1 year. Okay, so we've got our 3 keys. Now let's put them to work. The very first thing this system needs is an anchor date, a solid point on the timeline that everything else can be measured from. That date is 2034. And what's wild is the author gets to this exact same year using 2 totally different methods. So method number 1 is pretty simple, actually. The author says, look at the First World War back in 1914. They see this as the start of all those end-time signs mentioned in Matthew 24. Then they just apply that first key we talked about, 1 generation, which is 120 years. You do the math, 1914 plus 120, and there you have it, 2034. Okay, but now you got to see this. The author comes up with a second way to get to 2034, and it's completely different. This path starts way back in 34 AD with the death of Christ. This event is symbolized as the Ark of the Covenant crossing the Jordan River. And in that story, the people had to stay 2,000 cubits behind the Ark. So, using that third key, 1 cubit equals 1 year, that's 2,000 years. You add 2,000 years to 34 AD, and what do you get? Bam, 2034, the exact same year. You can see this whole thing is built on some really heavy symbolism. The Ark of the Covenant represents Jesus Christ. The Jordan River stands for death and resurrection. And then, get this, there's this really fascinating twist. The 12 stones that were left in the middle of the river, the author says those symbolize the founding of the United States of America. So there you have it. 2034 is locked in as this super important anchor point. Specifically, it's the year the Great Tribulation is supposed to end. And once that's set in stone, the rest of the entire timeline just kind of unfolds from there, piece by piece. So what happens right after 2034? According to this timeline, we enter a 13-year period of peace. The source says this time is for 2 big things: building up the house of the church, which is symbolized by the 13 years it took Solomon to build his house, and for sealing the 144,000 chosen ones. Okay, so once that 13-year period of peace is up, the next phase kicks in, and it's a big one, the 7 trumpets of judgment from the book of Revelation. Now remember our second key? Each trumpet blast signals 1 prophetic day, which is 3.5 years. So you've got 7 trumpets times 3.5 years each, which gives us a total of 24.5 years of judgment. All right, let's do the big calculation. We start with our anchor, 2034. We add the 13 years apiece, then we add the 24.5 years for the trumpets. But wait, there's one last little twist. The author subtracts 1 year right at the end. The reason given is that a year of grace gets taken away from that final trumpet period. You add it all up, and that's how we land right in the middle of 2070. So here it is, the whole grand timeline laid out. You can just follow it along. It all kicks off with our 2034 anchor, marking the end of the Great Tribulation. Then that period of peace ends in 2047, which leads right into the trumpets. That brings us to 2070, the start of the Millennium. Flash forward 1,000 years, Satan gets released for a bit, and that whole sequence leads us to the final date on here, the start of eternity, in the year 3240. So let's zoom in a little on what's supposed to happen after that 1,000-year millennium is over. The source lays out a 120-year period where Satan is let loose again to stir up one last rebellion. After that, there's a final 49-year jubilee period, kind of like a great reset. And that takes us right to the very doorstep of eternity. And this table just breaks down that final math for us. We start at 2070. Add 1,000 years for the millennium, that gets us to 3070. Add 120 years for that final rebellion, now we're at 3190. And finally, we add 50 more years. That's the 49-year jubilee, plus that very first year of eternity itself. And the grand total? The year 3240. Okay, so there's a huge question hanging over all of this, right? I mean, what about those super famous verses in the Bible that say, no one can know the day or the hour? Well, the author knew people would ask that, and they addressed this pretty head-on. And here's their core justification, straight from the source. The argument goes like this. Jesus said you can't know the specific day and hour, sure, but he never said you couldn't know the year or the season. And the idea is that this information was intentionally kept hidden from people in the past, but it's being revealed now. For us, the generation that's actually going to live through it all. Which brings us to one last thought here. Whether you buy into these calculations or think they're a total stretch, you have to admit the system itself is pretty fascinating. And it really leaves you with a much bigger question, doesn't it? What does this incredibly detailed search for a divine roadmap tell us about our own very human need for certainty, especially when we're staring down the biggest unknown of all?